And this is the other thing. They ask, why are they so feverish? Why are they so feverish about Israel? I did a very unpleasant sum some years ago, a few years into the Syrian civil war, which was, if you add up all of the people killed on both sides of every conflict involving Israel from 1948, including the War of Independence, right up to the present, and you include the highest estimated death tolls on not just the side of Israel, but on the side of Egypt, Jordan, everyone else, you get an average 6 months killing in Syria over the last decade.
Astonishing.
Right. So why would it be that if you are a Pakistani Muslim in London, you didn't turn out one Saturday for the killing of your co-religionists by Bashar al-Assad? You didn't spend one weekend outside the Chinese embassy for the putting into concentration camps of 1 million Muslims in China. You didn't turn out in massacre after massacre, in country after country. But this country, Israel, does one thing, never mind a war, one thing, and the streets erupt. Why? Muslim anti-Semitism is one of the variants of anti-Semitism and is the most prevalent and pushing in our time. And it terrifies the leaders of Western democracies because they have brought this into the West and they don't know what to do about it. Don't forget that all of our lives, you're a bit younger than me, but all of our lives, every politician in the West, from both political sides, said the same thing. They said that the solution to all of the Middle East's problems was the creation of a Palestinian state. They said that. Didn't matter if it was David Cameron or Ed Miliband.
It's the foreign policy orthodoxy that astonishingly hasn't shifted with the October 7th massacre.
It hasn't shifted. Amazingly enough, these people are still saying this. And it should by now be demonstrable, not just the Palestinians were already given a state in 2005 and created a terror state.
In Gaza, of course.
In Gaza. So, I mean, don't see why they should be given another go, and another go, and another go. Particularly not after October 7th. I don't see why you should reward the terrorism of that day by doubling down on the two-state solution. But when you look at that analysis that we were told all the time growing up, the orthodoxy, if the Palestinians can only get a state and live happily side by side with by the Israelis, you know, the economy of Yemen will blossom, the Ayatollahs in Iran will realize that women aren't dirt, and so on. No, of course not. It doesn't have any impact on any of the problems of the region. You think that North Africa is going to get sorted out or anything just because there's another failed Arab state? Of course not. But that has dissolved in front of our eyes. It has been as proven to be wrong as anything can be proven to be wrong in international relations. And yet they still say it. Because the West believes that peace is the human norm, inheritance, and right. It's a human right to live in peace. It isn't.
Isn't it?
There is no such right. No such right exists in nature. It is a wonderful thing to have, but it can be taken away like all rights. It's the problem of the language of rights. The language of rights is taught as if rights exist like oxygen, and they don't. They only exist if they are fought for and maintained. And they can only be maintained if people who would threaten your rights, including your most basic rights like your right to life, are not allowed to succeed. There is no law of nature that makes peace the norm. It isn't the norm historically. We are deeply blessed to have lived in the past few generations in a world in which it was relatively the norm in Western democracies.
Thanks to total victory in 1945.
Thanks to total victory in 1945 and then again in 1989, 1990. And seeing off the two twin horrors of the 20th century of fascism and communism. But it is not the norm. But if you grew up in the post-war dividend, the post-Cold War dividend, you could easily come out with the misunderstanding that this was the normal state of human affairs. It isn't. Why do they say genocide in Gaza?
Because it's been the wet dream of every anti-Semite since the end of the Holocaust to haul the Jews up in an international court on charges that they are the true Nazis.
Sure. And to hurt you. When they call you the new Nazis, why would they do that? Of all the figures in history to seize upon, why do they do Nazis? Because they want to hurt you. They want to wound you as deeply as possible. And they have chosen these weapons in the knowledge that it's how you hurt Jews. That's why. They've been doing it for years. They've been doing it for years. They could easily choose something else to do or to say, some other analogy to pull up if there's a mistake on the battlefield. They were thrilled, a lot of the international media, at that awful, unimaginable thing. Can you imagine the soldiers who made that mistake? Can you imagine how they live with themselves? There were more than 3 casualties there. The 3 poor young men who were killed and the person responsible for killing them. At least sympathy should be due in such a situation. But no,
I find that we've lost that sympathy.
Yes. Because of this dynamic we're getting to the root of here. This dynamic of what do you actually want here? Do you want Israel to win? Do you want them to draw? Or do you want them to lose? For instance, very, very important dynamic. But this one about believing Hamas and not believing Israel, it's an extension of something I've seen all my life covering the conflicts in this region, which is that it's just a lot easier to take that view. It's a lot easier to take Hamas's body count figures and just report them. You know, a bomb landed an hour ago, 500 people are dead, strangely round number, considering it took months for Israel to work out how many people were killed on the 7th of October, because it takes time. But there's a reason why people accept that figure, those figures, and they accept them because it's a lot easier than sending your own journalists into an incredibly dangerous area with an incredibly dangerous group of people, Hamas, and trying to verify it.
To the credit of the international media, they do press on the question of why their journalists are not allowed independent access into Gaza, and the Israeli Supreme Court has already ruled on that issue because of fears about exposing troop movements.
Yeah, and but the point with this is, if they do want to go like that, they know how dangerous it would be. If you're a Western journalist, you can put your life in the hands of the IDF and in bed with the IDF in Gaza, as I've done, or you could try to go in with Hamas, and you better keep your fingers crossed.
And then we've seen in previous conflicts as well, where they then will never release footage, when the journalists have been in Gaza, never release footage of dead Hamas terrorists, never release footage of rockets being fired from the middle of urban areas, because they know that Hamas will dictate the terms of what they can let out of Gaza. And they know in this war as well that the information coming out of Gaza is what Hamas wants them to see.
I've seen this all my life in this conflict. I have a friend who's a Palestinian journalist who lives in Jerusalem who you probably know, who can't go to the West Bank since he was rude about Yasser Arafat many years ago, and exposed his corruption and so on. It was made perfectly clear to my friend that he was, if you come back, you'll be hanged from a lamppost. Well, Palestinian journalists learn from that sort of thing. I can't help.
And therefore self-censor.
Yes. And Palestinian journalists in Gaza, are you joking? By contrast, I mean, I do notice that the Israeli media is not shy about being rude about Benjamin Netanyahu or indeed any other politician.
They speak, as we say, frankly.
They speak frankly, and good luck to them. That's what it's like being in a noisy democracy. But again, we should be aware of the vulnerability here. The mistake can arise that Israel is the one in the tricky situation, the wrong situation. Look, even Haaretz says this about the prime minister.
Right.
What do the Palestinians say about their leadership? Oh, they seem fine with it.
Yes, and I've had that in a BBC interview where they quoted a Chaim Levinson piece saying that the IDF is putting lipstick on nonsense, and the BBC journalist asked me, that is what you are doing. You are putting lipstick on nonsense. Fairly bizarre accusation to place.
It's a weird phrase.
And yes, a very weird phrase. But look, another of the things that I'm finding, speaking with the international media, that's very difficult to get this point across. We have actually a clip, I think one of the first viral moments that you had in this war, speaking about the question of proportionality. Let's watch this.
This is terribly, like, this format is very much like This Is Your Life.
Let's do another one of those in 40 years.
I've always thought that the whole idea of proportionality in conflict is absurd. It's something which I think Western countries and the UN, who always gang up on Israel whenever Israel is attacked, it's something that these people always obsess about only in the case of Israel. What is proportionate in a conflict? Proportionate in this conflict would mean that the response to the massacre of more than 1,000 Israelis in cold blood by Hamas a couple of weeks ago should be responded to by Israel by sending Israeli forces to rape exactly the same number of women as Hamas raped, and to decapitate exactly the same number of babies as Hamas decapitated, and to steal hundreds of Palestinians and hold them in dungeons and torture them as Hamas did. I mean, it's obscene to even think in these terms, and yet that's what proportionality would mean.
This is one of the things that I'm having difficulty with, and it comes up in every interview as the death toll, whatever it may be, rises, and there is clearly a great deal of suffering in Gaza, which we don't belittle or downplay for a moment. But I say, they ask me, why is this happening? How long is the killing going to continue? And I say, look, we didn't want this war. We didn't start this war. We didn't expect this war. Hamas declared war on us. None of this would be happening if Hamas had not declared this war, and if it were not fighting using the evil strategy of deliberately and strategically embedding itself under civilian areas. And I had this argument in a Sky News interview with Yalda Hakim as well. I said, you are falling into Hamas's trap. When you take this suffering and you blame Israel instead of the terror organization that launched this war, that is deliberately fighting this war from inside hospitals and under graveyards and tunnels under schools. You are playing into the strategy of the terror organization that is happy for the suffering to be disproportionate because it pulls on your heartstrings and generates the pressure that will let Hamas escape this war on its feet. To me, this point is so obvious, maybe because I've said it in 250 interviews. Why am I struggling to get that message across?
I don't know if you are struggling with it or not.
Well, if you think the message is getting through, then that would definitely give me a nice boost of motivation.
I hope it's getting through. It'll get through with some people. It'll get through to those with ears to listen, And I hope there are quite a lot of them.
But are they listening?
Well, I believe that there are still some, a majority, I think. But I would just add again, I say something you probably wouldn't, but I have a slightly harder line on this, which is that I believe that that the people of Gaza have a responsibility for voting in Hamas when they had an opportunity not to. They voted in Hamas knowing what Hamas are. They allowed Hamas to carry out the coup, killing Fatah and other Palestinians and dragging their bodies behind trucks in the West Bank, in Gaza. They didn't overthrow the government. You might say, well, that's a lot to expect. Well, it was always a lot to expect. Everywhere in the world that overthrew a despotic terrorist government, it was always a lot to expect. But okay, they didn't do that. They allowed 18 years, exactly the time you need to educate a child, for Hamas to indoctrinate a new generation, not of psychopaths, because you can't make psychopaths, but you can make sociopaths. 18 years is the time you need to create a sociopath. So they voted for Hamas, allowed Hamas to carry out the coup, didn't overthrow them, allowed them to indoctrinate an entire generation of sociopaths in Gaza. They then start a war, and they want this is Israel's fault. Israel has to respond in exactly the correct way. I'm sorry, I treat the Palestinians in Gaza in the same way I would treat any other group that produced a horror like that. They're responsible for their actions. They're responsible for their actions. We held the German people responsible for the fact that they voted in the Nazis and did not get them out. We held them responsible. And we, the Allies in the Second World War, did things that Israel would never dream of doing.
And by the way, it's a good thing that since the Second World War, the world created a system of international law to mitigate the horrors of war. We have no problem with international law. We enforce it, uphold it. The only question is it real international law that we are being expected to adhere to, or rules that NGOs have made up to try to make it impossible for Israel to win a war?
Well, we know the answer to this, because Israel was dragged to The Hague and is not guilty of the things they were being accused of.
In fact, is the victim of the things that it was accused
Right.
of.
I'm sorry, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine with no justification and has destroyed a generation of young Ukrainians.
Yeah.
The current enlistment age in the armed forces in Ukraine for the defense is people in their 40s. This is a disaster for a country. Now, why do people not talk about this as much as they talk about Israel? Funnily enough, Vladimir Putin doesn't much care if you think he's following the laws of war or not. I was in Kherson when he was shelling it still. And the Russian way of war, I can tell you from having seen it, is very brutal. Very brutal. But Vladimir Putin doesn't care if an NGO comes at him with human rights abuses. We come back to the Daniel Patrick Moynihan problem. Israel is partly vulnerable because Israel does care about that accusation. And there will in time be the risk that the countries that don't care look like the ones that do, and the ones that do care look like they're the ones that don't.
What do you mean?
It's the same paradox you come back to, which is if you actually do care about the laws of war, they will be used against you. If you don't care about them, everyone realizes you're just somebody who doesn't care.
Well, we do have to care about the laws of war
Of
and take them very
course.
seriously. The problem is...
I think we all do. I think every Western democracy does. But you can only do so if you, at the same time, say and recognize there is country after country in the world today that would stand as judge, juror, and executioner over this country that has no moral right to do so because they don't follow these rules.
Absolutely.
Don't judge a country by rules that you don't follow.
Not only rules you don't follow, rules you don't even think apply to you, because they create all these invented new standards to try to... It's not even a double standard, I think, as the Prime Minister said. It's a triple standard. One rule
Yes.
for the democracies, one rule for the dictatorships, another for Israel.